question is, you didn't like the name George?
I don't think it's a modern name. Sorry. It's just, Lawrence is a more modern name.
Yeah. Okay, well.
Okay.
It's going to sound.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here at the Bergan County Historical Society. I'm honored to talk about George Washington. I'm Johann Blau. I'm from New York City originally, and about 12 years ago, I crossed the George Washington Bridge and bought a house. And I have 2 children, and one of them, my son Larry, is named after Lawrence Washington. And Lawrence Washington was a very important person to George Washington. And George Washington crossed New Bridge in November 20th of 1776, leading his troops away from the Hudson River and across the Hackensack River, avoiding entrapment between the 2 rivers. And the question is, how did George Washington come to be the commander-in-chief? And it goes back to Lawrence Washington, is one thing. George Washington had a very difficult mother, and the historians at first, when George Washington died, they said, oh, what a wonderful mother the hero of our country must have had. But after about 150 years, they began to look at the evidence more and became bolder in their writings. And then they began to denounce her as difficult and controlling, unloving, complaining, and it goes on like this. And so the question is, George Washington was the firstborn of the second marriage of his father, Augustine. Augustine brought, the first marriage produced 2 sons, and Lawrence and a younger brother and sister. And the father brought Lawrence to England, the north of England, to go to school. And when he came back, he discovered that his first wife had died. And he needed a wife. In those days, you know, you had to have a husband, you had to have a wife. So he had a lawyer, George Eskridge, and the lawyer introduced him to this woman, a 23-year-old orphan named Mary Ball. And she was a nice-looking woman, and but she was unmarried at the age of 23, which meant that nobody wanted to marry her because she was so difficult. So, but he married her. Why did George Washington's father marry this difficult woman? And the answer is that she came with a piece of land. George Washington's father actually was in the new business of iron ore mining. And this woman, by remarkable coincidence, owned a piece of property exactly adjoining his iron ore property. So he married her, and really it didn't work out for him because she was relentlessly difficult. And my understanding of this situation is that the father then stayed away from the house. I mean, he has a younger sister and 3 younger brothers, George Washington, but the father, you know, it was the whole house was very difficult. So sometimes people can have a parent who's so difficult that it's really destructive of the whole family life. And ultimately, George Washington would join the militia. He joined the Virginia militia because that appealed to him, the substitute family of his fellow soldiers, not really fellow soldiers. He was an officer. He went into the Virginia militia as a major, and he enjoyed this camaraderie of the men. So what happened is that when George was 6 years old, Lawrence came from England, returning, he was 20, Lawrence. And George was kind of miserable at that point in his life, 6 years old. But in meeting Lawrence, Lawrence was a very lively guy, and it was a wonderful thing for George Washington. And today in Mount Vernon, there's just one picture in George Washington's study, and that is the famous picture of Lawrence Washington. So, unfortunately for George Washington, within about 2 years, Lawrence Washington joined a British attack on the Spanish in the Caribbean. And he would be away more than 2 years, Lawrence Washington. And the attack was a failure, especially at Cartagena, which is part of Colombia today. And actually, Lawrence Washington never got off the boat. The British military is divided, and it's divided today too. It's not noted really, but the army is actually considered under the control of Parliament, while the Navy is under the control of the king. The idea was to avoid a standing army that the king could control. So anyway, Lawrence came back and discovered that just to the south of, the father actually gifted Mount Vernon, which was originally known as Little Hunting Creek. He gifted it to Augustine Washington. And the way I connect the dots, it might have been a farewell present as his beloved son Lawrence was leaving on the big attack in the Caribbean. And so it was called Little Hunting Creek, but when Lawrence came back, he had been kind of saved and bonded with Admiral Vernon of the British Navy. And he then renamed Little Hunting Creek Mount Vernon in honor of the Admiral. And actually, he stayed in touch with the Admiral. It's really not well known at all, but he stayed in touch with the Admiral that he admired. And later on, when George was 14, Lawrence arranged for George Washington to join the Navy, the British Navy. And of course, if you understand the situation, the whole idea of your 14-year-old brother joining the British Navy is that it would get him away from his mother. And in fact, the mother put a kibosh on George's joining, and Washington writes that he had his bags packed, but the mother stopped it. So when Lawrence Washington came back, unfortunately, he was weakened with malaria. And malaria, when you're weakened with this kind of a disease, it allows another disease, an opportunistic disease, to attack you. In this case, Lawrence Washington came down with tuberculosis. They called it consumption. And he would fight this tuberculosis, which eventually killed him for about 9 years. So George Washington's father died when he was 11. And he then began to live at Mount Vernon. The father had moved George and the younger kids down to Fredericksburg, Virginia. But now, with the father dying, George began to live kind of at his brother Lawrence's house and his brother Austin's house. So when Lawrence came back, he discovered he had a neighbor, the Fairfaxes, William Fairfax, who was the cousin and land agent of the mighty Lord Fairfax, who was the largest landowner in Virginia, owning an enormous amount of property in the northern section of Virginia. And William Fairfax had a very beautiful daughter, Anne Fairfax, and Lawrence married 16-year-old Anne Fairfax. And there were many social events before the marriage, Sundays at the Fairfaxes. Their estate was called Belvoir. So George was invited to these soirees, and he was kind of adopted by William Fairfax as a second son. And he was very welcomed there at the Fairfaxes. George Washington was a terrific horseman, as was his mother, and they loved fox hunting. And teenage George Washington led the fox hunt. And it was a very involved, ceremonious thing where you capture the fox and tree the fox and cut off his tail, and then you could give the tail to one of the ladies there. But leaving that cruelty aside, he was a favorite of the Fairfaxes. And the Fairfaxes had all this property and all this influence. And George Washington now, his father is deceased, and he's taken on a surveying trip with the neighbor. William Fairfax's son was also named George. And George Washington went on the surveying trip. And then he taught himself to be a surveyor. And that's how we think of George Washington, the surveyor. So what happened to surveying? What happened is that Lawrence Washington comes back from this miserable attack, and he has the malaria, and he has the tubercular cough, and he asks George to go with him to Barbados. The only time Washington was out of the country was this trip to Barbados. And he had a wonderful time there, George Washington did, except that he came down with smallpox. George Washington had a few smallpox marks on his nose and face, not, disfiguring, but he also, in the opinion of some, and including me, is that Washington came down with tuberculosis. Lawrence had tuberculosis. They travel in the boat. Just in the boat, they were 7 weeks together every night in the cabin. Then they spent the days and days in Barbados. So it's obvious that Washington was completely and continuously exposed to the tubercular bacteria. And he writes in his diary when he comes back that he came down with pleurisy, which is another name for a lung disease. So Washington, on this trip with his beloved brother Lawrence, comes down with smallpox and tuberculosis, and one of them renders him infertile. But he doesn't know it at the time. So when he comes back, George Washington, from this trip to Barbados, he has heard the stories of Lawrence, the war stories, everything involving, every aspect of the Navy and the Army. And he now decides that he's not going to be a surveyor anymore. Now he decides that he's going to go and be a soldier. And because he's a Fairfax man, Lawrence Washington's younger brother, the Virginia governor, with not a day's experience as a soldier, appoint him as a major in the Virginia militia. So George Washington was a soldier for years, and the long and the short of it is that Washington had trouble. He wasn't oriented towards establishing close relationships. He had the relationship with Lawrence. But of course, you don't have to be, Freud to see that this kind of a difficult mother, very difficult, and the absentee father would affect Washington's, ability to relate to people. Just to go back a little bit to the mother, Washington became famous when he was 18 years old, and he kept being famous until, all through her life, and he dies when she's 56. It's almost 40 years that he was a famous Virginian. The mother never said one good word about him. Nobody quotes her as saying anything. He never. That's the way the woman was. He was respectful to his mother, but it was a very difficult situation, and it's not talked about very much. But when she died, not only didn't he come from Washington, D.C., where he was the president, to make a visit, no stone was ever put on her grave for his entire life, which, is a statement of something by the son and the other children, because his sister Betty lived right there in Fredericksburg. So what worked for Washington was this being a soldier, being an officer, and the men. And his marriage to Martha comes about entirely because Martha sets up a special meeting with him. And it's written about, of course, George Washington had no children. And Martha she actually gave birth to 4 children, 2 of whom survived. The girl died of seizures when she was 17, and the boy, Jackie Park Custis, whose father, Martha's first husband, was one of the richest men in Virginia. So Martha was a very rich woman, the richest woman in Virginia, and she wanted to have a husband. And anyway, one of her grandchild was named George Washington Park Custis. And he was a famous man in Washington, D.C., and would lecture on Washington, who was his step-grandfather, but actually he was kind of adopted. The 2 youngest kids were kind of adopted by the Washington, so he would call himself the adopted son of George Washington. Anyway, his memoirs were published, his memoirs were published, and in his memoirs, 100 years after the event, he reveals how Martha set up this meeting with George Washington. There was a crossing of the river, the Pamunkey River, and she timed it. Martha Washington was a very intelligent woman, very capable woman. She's kind of not given enough credit, but Washington went down, crossing the Pamunkey River ferry, down to Williamsburg to get medical advice. So she timed his return. The ferryman must have told her, yeah, he's coming back. So when he returns from Williamsburg, the man who owned the property where the ferry was, these ferries were all on private property, approaches Washington and says, won't you be my guest at dinner? Dinner at that time was at 3 or 4 o'clock. And Washington says, no, look, I'm a busy guy, thanks anyway. And the guy says, well, please, I have this guest, Martha Park Custis. So Washington gets the idea, and he was an accommodating guy. So he goes and has dinner. He stays through the night. He finds himself, just to give a sentence here, alone with Martha Washington. She's arranged that the whole wing should be cleared out. So anyway, in the morning, they were engaged, but they didn't announce an engagement, but they considered themselves privately to be engaged. Now, there's one other person in Washington's life that has to be mentioned, and that is Anne Fairfax, who's the daughter of William Fairfax. Anne Fairfax has a sister-in-law. George Fairfax gets married to Sally Fairfax. And Sally Fairfax becomes the second most important person in George Washington's life. She teaches him to dance. She's not a beauty, but she's charismatic. And he actually writes her a love letter while she's married. And he's with the British now, attacking the French in the Ohio Valley. And this is really the most famous love letter in American history. It's called the Votary of Love letter. And he's writing kind of in code, but it's obvious that he's writing to Sally. Now, what happens is that nothing happens between him and Sally. But later on, when he marries Martha, George and Sally Fairfax, they become best friends. The 2 neighbors are now always together. They're a foursome. Now, he marries Martha, he drops out of the public sight, and then what happens is that it's the 1770s, and everybody's got to pick a side. You're either with the loyalist or you're a patriot. And George Fairfax, who's kind of a nerdy guy, he has to be a loyalist because he's hoping to inherit his older cousin's vast property, which he never does. But he goes back to Britain with Sally, and she never returns. So this is a big blow, really, to George Washington. The leaving of Sally Fairfax, and that happens in 1773. And it's after that Washington becomes more active in the Continental Army. He has no children, and he has no Sally. I mean, he loves Martha. He loves his wife, Martha, but he also loves Sally. I mean, he doesn't ever say, I love you like that, but actually, what happened was that George Fairfax eventually died, and Washington, who's retired as a general at this point, writes Sally and says, come back. And it's a famous letter, and it was a scandalous letter. When it was finally put up for auction, when she dies, her estate eventually put it up for auction, and it was considered a scandal. The first love letter, and then this other subsequent letter. But so George Washington now goes to the First Continental Congress. He's selected as one of the leading military man of Virginia, and now he goes to the Second Continental Congress. And at the Second Continental Congress, he's wearing a soldier's uniform, his Virginia militia uniform. But it's not his uniform from 10 years ago. He has a new uniform made, okay? George Washington loves clothes. To me, it's clear that he loves clothes because he was deprived by that mother of having clothes, of, the latest clothes and everything. So now, as an adult, he loves clothes, and he looks great there. George Washington is over 6'2". I discovered the secret to George Washington's height, and that is that he is a smidgen shorter than Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was about 6'2½", so Washington was about 6'2 3/8". Anyway, on June 15th, 1775, Washington is appointed the commander-in-chief, and he leaves immediately for Boston. And this is the first start of the Revolutionary War. And the first act is in Boston. Knox brings in these guns. They put them in the heights overlooking Boston Harbor, and the Boston commander says, listen, you don't blow up our boats, we'll leave and we won't burn the town. And then Washington, they leave, and it's a great victory, but the battle is just moving to New York. And of course, the British land an enormous army and an enormous navy, and they're militarily experienced. So they take the Battle of Brooklyn, and Washington and his men have to escape across the East River. Then they take Manhattan. Then Washington goes up to Westchester, and then they build two forts. One is Fort Lee, and one across the Hudson is Fort Washington. Now, Washington is busy up in Westchester, and he's not here on the scene in New Jersey. And some people are telling him, evacuate Fort Lee, evacuate Fort Lee. They had the forts because they wanted to stop the British Navy from coming up the Hudson and controlling the Hudson. But the British demonstrated that they could sail the boats, and it was, so Washington just gets here, and Greene, General Greene, is somewhat insistent. We can hold Fort Washington, or we can evacuate the men. Greene really, is new to the military, and he was a very organized guy, what we would call today a logistics guy. But he didn't have this kind of experience to be able to make this determination. And Washington, starts inspecting the whole situation. Washington gets on a boat and crosses the Hudson, and they're looking at it, and should we evacuate? And then all of a sudden, the British attack Fort Washington. And Greene and the other commanders thought, oh, this is like Gibraltar. We have our own Gibraltar here. It's impregnable, because if you look at the cliffs and everything. But they really miscalculated, and the British take Fort Washington very rapidly. In one day, the British and the Hessians take Fort Washington. So one of the critical things that happens, in my opinion, is that Washington does not criticize General Greene. He could easily have said publicly or privately, gee, I listened to Greene, and Greene, misled me, or it's Greene's mistake. He doesn't say that. He doesn't criticize Greene, and I think that was a very important thing. because only days later, the British now continue the fight. Cornwallis gets on the boats and crosses the Hudson, goes up the Palisades, and Washington and Greene both immediately order that Fort Lee to be abandoned. And, you know, they left the fires burning, they left their supplies, and it's a difficult moment. And Washington realizes that if they don't cross the Hackensack River, that the British could capture them, trap them between the Hudson and the Hackensack. So they go up a little bit. You know, they don't go straight across, but he has to go up a little bit. Washington meets the troops at the Liberty Pole, which stood in Englewood. It's at the traffic circle, I believe, which is why we don't notice it, but I believe that's where the Liberty Pole was. And then Washington leads them right across New Bridge to this side. The British are not right behind, but they come like the next day. The British go down in a different manner. You know, they don't exactly follow Washington at this point, although Washington has the lead on them. And it's Thomas Paine is with them, and it's people are deserting, and their enlistments are up, and an army that Washington had in New York City of maybe, you know, up to 15,000 men is now down to about 3,000. So eventually Washington goes down, and when he comes to the Raritan River, he's thinking of making a stand there. But as he's thinking about this, his artillery unit is making a tremendous barrage, a very effective barrage against the British, and they're halted there. And who's leading that barrage is Alexander Hamilton. And Washington sees, wow, this is very well done. And he now has Hamilton brought to him. He's very impressed with Hamilton. Washington got up every morning and started the day with his correspondence. And he then gave out all of these orders and letters. And so he didn't want to write the whole letter. He wanted what he called his penmen to write the letter. He'd tell them, this, and they would write it out, and he would read it, and then he would sign. So he saw that Hamilton would be perfect as one of the guys in headquarters. And Hamilton now comes into the headquarters where he'll stay for 4 years. So Washington is now retreating, and he comes down. He decides not to make a stand at the Raritan River. He goes all the way down to the Delaware. But at the Delaware, he doesn't jump across the Delaware. He sends his baggage across. He sends equipment and baggage. And he takes 1,200 men, and he wants to fight. He's ready to fight the British. But he sees that the British have a tremendous army at that moment. So he decides not to fight, but rather to get to the other side, to Pennsylvania. Now, the commander-in-chief of the British is General Howe. And again, his brother is sent to be the head of the Navy. You see, the king didn't want any of this conflict between the Army and the Navy. So by sending the two brothers, he was avoiding this historic conflict that the British had. So General Howe had a great success in the year of 1776. He took New York City. He chased Washington. At the fall of Fort Washington, he captured 2,900 men and all of these munitions. And he now he takes Fort Lee, and he tells Cornwallis he doesn't want to end the year with a disaster. So he tells Cornwallis, I'll meet you, okay, in New Brunswick. So Cornwallis has to wait there, allowing Washington a chance to organize. And finally, Howe gets to New Brunswick, and they have a lovely dinner, the two generals, and he gives them the go-ahead. Okay, go, Cornwallis. But by this time, Washington is crossed the has crossed the Delaware, and he's there he's there and he's scooped up all the boats. I think Washington himself thought of the idea of scooping up all the boats. So the British get there, there's no boats. I mean, they could have started building boats, but it's December, and the European style is you fight during the summer, and in the winter, you just take it easy and drink. So he leaves the Hessians there at Trenton, and he spreads out the army. So because if he left an army of 5,000 in one spot, it'd be harder for that army to feed itself and to get hay for the horses. So by spreading it out, he wanted to extend the area that would feed the men and the horses. So there was only 1,500 Hessians there. And of course, Washington on December 26th crosses over, and they didn't surprise them, but the general, the Hessian general, was kind of arrogant, and he didn't build any defensive works. He said, when they come, we'll just get them with a bayonet. They were very good with the bayonets. Anyway, Washington came, and they got the artillery, Hamilton, and another artillery piece, kind of on a hill. And the Hessians were at the bottom of the hill. And when the British and the Germans got to New Jersey, even in Long Island, they were just plundering. They were just plundering every house they could get a hold of. And they didn't even ask, is this a loyalist house? They just plundered the house, they take the whole contents. So all of these people, the men and the boys, what could they do but fight the plunderers? So they were joining, Washington's army. So they were charged up. They were very charged up, and the Hessians were, at the end of the day, mercenaries, and they surrendered. So Washington then sends off the captured Hessians very effectively. And actually that night they recross the Delaware to sleep in their own campground. And then Washington, there was tremendous, the enlistments were up, which is why Washington crossed at the end of December, because the enlistments were up. So he pleads with the men to extend their enlistment. He has them all lined up. And after he's pleading, after this, victory over the Hessians, nobody steps forward. Nobody steps forward. But he doesn't give up Washington. He goes right into it again, just like, an encyclopedia salesman. He says, your homes, your daughters, your families, you gotta, and you'll be paid a bonus. So then somebody, an unknown person, steps forward, and then the others step forward, and like many of them didn't, but more than half did. So they go back, and they're in Trenton, and he sets up defensive lines. And eventually Cornwallis gets there. But Washington has had them harassed all the way. They get there like in the late afternoon. But the British strategy, military strategy, was to immediately attack. You get there, your men are tired, so what? Immediately attack. Don't let none of this maneuvering. So he attacks at the Assunpink Bridge. But Washington has set up the artillery and the rifles, and they can't get it. They're just getting slaughtered. The historians write that the bridge was red with British blood. So that's when Cornwallis famously says, I'll bag the fox in the morning. But that night, Washington had a council of war. Now, there was a great difference between the British and the Americans and Washington, because Washington was a person who listened to what other officers had to say. Where the British system was, the general was totally in control. He called the shots. Everybody obeyed them. Anyway, Washington, I didn't make the point that I wanted to make, and that is that from the very beginning, when Washington started in Boston and came down to New York, he established a relationship with his officers and his men. And it wasn't a band of brothers, because he wasn't the brother, he was more like the father. But it was like a family. It was a certain family connection that he established. He didn't have any favorites. He didn't pick one general out and, drink late into the night with that favorite. It was always, any kind of promotions were done on the basis of merit. So anyway, they slip away during the night, and Washington goes north, and I'll finish soon. Washington goes north. Now, as he goes north, he realizes that New Brunswick is here, and that's where Cornwallis has his money and his armament. That's his depot. And some of the officers say, let's go get New Brunswick. Well, Washington says, the guys have done enough. And he just continues north into Morristown for the winter. Now, when Cornwallis is chasing Washington, he gets to the same fork in the road. He doesn't know where Washington's gone. So he has to go to the right and go to New Brunswick. And that ends I left out the Battle of Princeton, but the point is, after Trenton and then Princeton, Washington gets with his surrogate family, the men and the officers, he gets up to the mountains there in Morristown, and that's where they spend the first winter, up in Morristown. So that ends the fighting, and Washington has scored a great success, and it's called the 10 Days that changed the world. And eventually Washington would come back here to Newbridge. He comes back in 1780, and when he comes back, the war has essentially ended in the north. What happens is that the British eventually take Philadelphia, and then the French come in. The Americans win at Saratoga, and that inspires the French to sign an alliance with the Americans. And then when the British see that the French are in, they decide to evacuate Philadelphia and consolidate in New York. And on the way up is when Washington attacks at Fort Monmouth. Fort Monmouth, the British ran away after the day of fighting, and the Americans held the field. And that ended the fighting really in the north. And after that, the British tried to win the war in the south. But Washington, from Trenton, from the retreat, through the victory at Trenton, through the eventual victory at Fort Monmouth, they won in the north. And there was some other fighting, but the British saw that they could never win up here. And that ended the fighting in the north. And so when Washington came here, there was an encampment here, the Steen Rapi. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
I always say Steen Rapi.
Okay, it means like a rocky place. And he had 14,000 men, at that point, because people were joining because it was a victorious situation. It was, the chances of dying were smaller, and the cause was great. And so they were here, camped along Kinderkamack Road from River Edge, Oradell. Unfortunately, right after he's encamped here, he goes to a meeting with the French, and then discovers the whole treachery of Benedict Arnold. Comes right after the encampment here. So I think I'll end right there. Anybody have any questions or anything? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yes?
Yes, sir. I was thinking, is there any remnants of Fort Lee, Fort Washington, Fort Wayne? Are there any physical evidence of their existence around?
Well, there is a historic Fort Lee. I'm not.
Some of the fort is
No,
Fort Lee Historic Park. Pretty-
Oh, there you go.
It's a very nice building, very nice story of the whole town.
Yes,
Yeah.
at Fort Lee.
Visiting, a battery, I think it's there.
Oh, yeah, we done that.
So,
Yeah.
Yes, but where the actual fort was, I think is delineated with some blue markers
I see.
that are tall. They're very high up and they're small blue ones, but they're like 8 feet up or something. But you can see them actually on a website that is a free marker database. And I have it listed under our marker program. And so you can look up this, I think it's hmdd.org. And you can look markers up from all over the country to go see, but they have a transcription of the markers on that page. That's why I really gave up doing a publication of our markers, because you might as well just go to this website.
HMDD, you said?
I think it's HMDD.
Historical Market Database.
Right. .org.
Did George Washington ever see this? Was he ever?
The Council of War that was mentioned with the steam rapid encampment, believed to have taken place in this building. And we interpreted the upstairs room, the north upstairs room, which is finished as the Washington room. It's got beautiful paneling and all.
Do you know of other locations where he actually slept? Still
He slept at the Dye House, of course, the Dye Mansion, and DeWint.
Well, he was at, what's funny about here, the two Zabriskie brothers, well, more than two, but the Johann Zabriskie who owned this house, and his brother Peter, who owned the mansion on the green in Hackensack, right across from the courthouse. But Peter was Continental, he was American, and in favor of the cause. And that's where Washington stayed when, just prior to meeting Greene at the Liberty Ball, when he got word that the British had scaled the Palisades. He rode out as fast as he could. Kevin used to say it was like faster than you could go today to get there, to meet Greene, who was evacuating Fort Lee. And and then yet Johann Zabriskie that lived here ended up becoming a loyalist. And you think about divided families,
I have one last question. Do we know Washington's exact half of his route, his escape? I don't know when I was in Lodi on Union Street, there was a sign that said Washington.
Well, yes, it is marked with blue markers across the county, blue and red, yellow and gold. And then we have a map that I worked on, actually the base is from historian Claire Fall, architectural historian Claire Fall. She passed away a number of years ago, but we took that map and delineated the routes and the times, actually, of them crossing through Bergan County. And I worked on that with my late husband, Kevin Wright, and Padres. So that's available for sale. There's one in the hallway. We have the yeah. Sorry, is
that your question?
No,
that's Steuben. Major General Bergan Steuben, who was given this house at the end of the war because Congress didn't have money, cash, so they were giving out confiscated properties, and they confiscated it because, like I said, I put his portrait there because he was very, of course, known for training the troops at Valley Forge in beginning 1778, and but he was very critical of Major Baylor, who John Andre writes about in his 1778 journal, and he drew this map, which Newbridge appears on. He was very critical that Baylor let the sentries in his group, who were sleeping in scattered barns in Rivervale, let them fall asleep. And he had trained the troops to protect against that kind of thing. So I just put it there because I needed a space to put it somewhere because we put that map over there. So anyway, it's interesting, you know, of course, Andre was later hung as a spy, a British officer.
The skeletons, was that photograph of the Blau massacre?
Yes, and the society, the Historical Society was involved in that gig in the 60s when it was realized that some of the soldiers, there were 16 bayoneted to death. We were talking about expertise in bayonets, and so some of them were thrown into a tanning bath. And somebody remembered, I guess, doing some research, and then they dug them up and they're reburied in that location. And obviously that photos from that day.
That's haunted.
What's that?
It's haunted, supposedly.
Yeah. We have a member, past president, who goes there every year. He goes there every year to watch over it on that night. He's in his 80s, but he goes and to remember that event.
It's a very nice site, you know, simple, but it's nice, well done.
Yeah, that's now a county site, and they have put up markers. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
okay, thank you very much.